Hello, class. I appreciate your understanding that I couldn't be there today. I'm sorry to miss, but I thought that was better than maybe bringing a germ to use and for me to stay at home. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but thank you for your understanding. I have sent the Module 3 quiz to your parents. Remember, this is just covering the first page of notes from last week, which was bacteria. Today, we're going to finish up talking about Module 3. So we're going to talk about the multicellular algae. We talked about unicellular algae last week. We're also going to talk a little bit about fungi and plants. So if you have not printed out the notes for the second half for part B of this module, go ahead and do that now so you have them. And come back and let's get started. So let's go over a few general characteristics about multicellular algae, which are also called the seaweeds, okay? So they are multicellular. They're eukaryotic organisms, and everything that we'll talk about for the rest of this year, or at least as we go through the next few modules, and we're talking about organism, we're going to be talking about eukaryotic organisms that they have a membrane-bound organelles, and the DNA is enclosed in a nucleus, right? And these multicellular algae are also photosynthetic, which shouldn't surprise you. They have more complex structures than single-celled algae, which also is no surprise. And their reproductive strategies are also more complex than single-celled algae. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Algae, these multicellular algae are beneficial to the marine environment because they provide food for organisms, they provide protection from the waves if it's algae near the shoreline, they provide a place for other organisms to attach or live, and so very beneficial. All right, well, the first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about the basic structure of multicellular algae. Not every form of multicellular algae has all of these components in their body structure, but they have some or all. All right, so the first term on your list that we're going to define is this word thallus. Okay, the word thallus is just referring to the complete body of the algae. Okay, the algae looks kind of like a plant, but it's not. It doesn't have true stems or leaves or roots like a true plant does, but it looks similar. Okay, so the whole body, the whole structure of the multicellular algae, this whole thing is called a thallus. All right, so they do have some structures that look like leaves, but they don't function the same way as a leaf. They don't have veins. Their upper and lower surfaces are the same, where in a leaf of a true plant they are different, but they are kind of flattened and look like a leaf. So blades are the leaf-like structure. These plants also have something called nematocysts. Okay, nematocysts are just bulb-shaped little bladders filled with air or gas, and the purpose of these is to help the algae to float, and so this keeps them upright and closest to the surface of the water where they can get maximum sunlight, right? And so they do have a structure that is similar to a stem. It doesn't function just like a stem, called a stipe. And so that would be the structure that holds the blades and connects them to the thallus. Okay, and then they also have a structure that is similar to roots, but doesn't quite function like a root of a plant, and this is called a holdfast. Okay, a holdfast does serve as an anchor, just like roots do, but they do not absorb water and nutrients like roots do in a plant. Okay, so these are the structures. You can see them there in that little image to the side, and see how it looks similar to a plant, but not quite, right? So when we're talking about algae, basically there are three different types of multicellular algae. There's green, brown, and red. So we'll go through a few characteristics about each one, and then we'll talk just a little bit about reproductive strategies, but we're not going into a lot of detail about that. All right, so for green algae, this is phylum Chlorophyta. That chloro part tells you that it has the pigment chlorophyll, and phyta is referring to plant-like. Okay, so these are found, they're widespread in marine, freshwater, and even on land. This type of algae can be found all over, right? And so it is chlorophyll that makes them have that bright green appearance, right? Chlorophyll. So it makes the thallus bright green. Some of these organisms are planktonic, and remember that just means that they float, right? They float, but they might also have flagella that can help them move through the water, but it's not strong enough to move them against the current, so they are still considered planktonic. These types of algae can cause blooms in tide pools and salt marshes. So these are areas where there's not a lot of wave action or disturbance to the surface, so they're able to bloom, and it gets a lot of sunlight, and so it's able to bloom. Some of these are going to be filamentous. Filamentous. All right. Filamentous just kind of referring to not a leafy-like structure, but the structures are a little bit more stem-looking. Let's see, kind of like on that red algae, that picture of red algae on the back of your page. That's more of a filamentous structure. And they can grow on surfaces too, okay? So the example that your book gave for green algae, there's one called ulva. That's the scientific species name, but it's commonly called sea lettuce. It is edible. It's found in diverse environments, in marine environments. It has a very flat thallus that's only about 2 cells thick, and so probably a very delicate looking thing, but a good source of food. And the other one is Halimeda. This one has a dusty white appearance because it produces calcium carbonate, which is a chalky substance, and because of that and the remains of this, when it dies, that chalky substance can form limestone in the bottom of the ocean, and it can also just increase the amount of calcium carbonate in the sediment, which makes a good base for coral to grow. So that's an important feature of green algae. All right. So moving along, we'll talk about brown algae. This is in the phylum Phaeophyta. So these are found mostly in cold marine environments. They have a yellow pigment called fucoxanthin. Okay, that yellow pigment sort of masks the effect of the bright green chlorophyll. So these algae often appear a kind of a deeper green, a brownish green, an olive color, sometimes brown, but they might have a filamentous thallus, but they could also have a branching thallus. Okay, and that's just what you would think it is. It's branching off into different directions. Okay, so the cell walls of brown algae have a component in them called algin, and algin is used in industries for people because it works well as an emulsifying agent. And so you think about adding it to salad dressings and other substances that will give it that consistency that you want, and so oil and water don't mix, but algin added to that will help to emulsify and keep the oil suspended in the water so they don't separate, and that's just one use that it has. So the leaves or the the blades of this algae may be thick and leathery, and that just helps to prevent moisture loss. Remember, a lot of these organisms living in the ocean, they have to manage losing water taking on salt, and so this helps to prevent water loss for them. They also may have nematocyst, again, that will help their leaves to float. Okay, so the examples that your book gives for brown algae, there's one called fucus, which is also known as rockweed, and it grows exactly where you would think. It grows on rocky shores. Okay, there's also one called sargassum, which grows on rocks, again, but some of them float. The Sargasso Sea is kind of named after this floating algae because it grows in such large quantities there that's in abundance in that area. They kind of have grape-like clusters of these nematocysts that help them to float, and they're carried around with the current, so they are kind of considered planktonic in that way. The other one is Macrocystis, which is the giant kelp. If you've ever seen pictures of kelp forest in the ocean, these algae can grow up to 100 meters long. So that's really tall, and they can grow in dense groups, which make them look like a kelp forest under the ocean. But these are important as a food source. They're harvested for food. Okay. So the next example of algae, or the third type of algae, is the red algae. These are in phylum Rhodophyta, and there's actually more types of red algae than there are green and brown combined. They thrive in dimly lit areas at depths below 200 meters of the ocean, so not a lot of light is going to penetrate down that far, but they can thrive in this. Okay, and so they are mostly filamentous in their structure. Right, so not leafy looking, not wide blades, but some of their filaments can be up to 2 meters long. They have a pigment called phycobilins. Okay, phycobilins is what makes the algae appear red. So phycobilins is what's called an accessory pigment. So some of these organisms have accessory pigments that kind of aid the chlorophyll in photosynthesis. These accessory pigments, and phycobilins in this case, is able to absorb the dim blue light that can reach down into the depths of the ocean, and then help to convert that energy into energy that chlorophyll can use for photosynthesis in that plant. Okay, and so agar is a substance that's found in red algae, and agar is used to culture bacteria. But there's also another type of substance. Sorry, I'm going to write this down below. Carrageenan is another emulsifying agent like algin that is made by red algae, that is also used in the food industry, so important to humans in that way. Your book gave an example of corallina as a type of red algae. The corallina deposit calcium carbonate in their cell walls, and so they are involved in the formation of coral reef, and so they have that coral red color, but they also help coral to form, and so and this is probably what lends to their name, right? So that's a quick overview of the three types of algae, multicellular algae, that your book covers. It goes into a lot more detail, but if you're reading and doing your own questions, you're covering that detail, and for the purposes of our test, we're not going into any more detail than that, right? As you're studying these algae, there's not a lot of new vocabulary, but you should be noticing some differences and also some similarities in these different types of algae, and think about how that might come up as a question on the test. Okay, and so reproduction. Your book spends a couple of pages or more talking about the different types of reproduction in multicellular algae. It's pretty complex and a lot to remember, and the author of the book even says, like, it's not necessary for you to memorize all that, and I certainly wouldn't require it either. We're not going to into much detail about reproduction as far in terms of the specific strategies and the specific life cycles of the different plants. She only named 4, but as she said, there's more than that. So it can be very complex and very specific to different types of plants. There's just a few terms I want you to remember about reproduction in algae. So these seaweeds can reproduce asexually or sexually, or in both ways. And some of the cycles kind of have life cycles kind of have both types of reproduction. All right, but here's the few words that I want you to remember, and these are not new because we covered them in biology when we talked about plant reproduction. Okay, but the first one is this idea or this concept of alternation of generations. Okay, and what that simply means is that in that life cycle of the algae, it is going to alternate between a sexual stage and an asexual stage. Okay, so the sexual stage is going to be the gametophyte stage, and the asexual stage is going to be the sporophyte phase. Okay, and so the next thing that we're going to do is define those terms. So these are the other 2 terms that you would need to kind of recall. All right, the gametophyte phase is going to be the phase that produces gametes. And remember, gametes are specific reproductive cells. The female gamete is the egg, and the male gamete is the sperm. Okay, and so these are reproductive cells that when they come together, they produce a zygote. Okay, so this is a sexual reproduction because you're getting genetic information from the sperm and from the egg, right? So there's diversity there. Okay, but the sporophyte generation produces spores. And so the best way I can help you think about this is a spore is like a seed. Okay, it has the potential to become a new organism. But the thing about the spores in algae is that the spore can either have just one set of genetic information, or it could have 2 sets, right? And then the spore itself may divide. If it's a carpospore, which means it's 2N, it's diploid and has 2 sets, then it can divide to produce a cell that just has 1 set of genetic information. But spores can produce a thallus. Remember, the thallus is the body of the algae that just has one set of the genetic information. It doesn't have both. Okay, if both sets of genetic information were available, then it would become a zygote, and that's talking about a gametophyte generation, not a sporophyte generation. Okay, so it's kind of complicated to understand. You can go back through and read that section in your book and apply these terms. But again, I don't expect you to remember a lot of detail about these different life cycles, since they are just a small representation of other, and there are others that algae will use to reproduce. Okay, so that's all we're going to say about that. Let's move on. Excuse me. So kingdom fungi. Again, these are going to be all eukaryotic organisms. Fungi can be single-celled or multi-celled. There's several hundred species of marine fungi. Okay, they can have bodies that are made, their bodies are made of long thread-like tubes called hyphae. Your book doesn't give this specific term, and I'm a little surprised, but hyphae are those long filaments that make up the body of fungi. Okay, and so hyphae contain nuclei, and that's what makes them eukaryotic, right? Because the DNA is in a nucleus. But the hyphae may contain multiple nuclei that are all in one single cell, and so there's terms that we use when we're talking about hyphae where there is separation. Okay, so if the hyphae has separation between the nuclei, we call that septate, if you'll remember that from biology. And if it doesn't have that separation, then it's called non-septate, okay? And so, but because it has multi-nuclei in it, then we can say that it's multicellular. Okay, and so most fungi in the marine fungi are going to be microscopic decomposers, so they function a lot like bacteria. They are there to break down the dead and decaying matter in the ocean. So they're there to help with that process and release those nutrients back into the environment for other organisms to use, right? And as we mentioned in biology, fungi can form a symbiotic relationship. That just means that they're in a relationship with another organism. Okay, sometimes both organisms benefit, sometimes they don't. And so there's different terms for those different types of relationships, right? But when fungi have a relationship with algae, and we find a lot of that in the ocean, we call that lichen, okay? So lichen is just that relationship between a fungus and an algae, where the fungus provides support and protection for the organism, and the algae provides the nutrition that is made by photosynthesis. All right, and so that kind of relationship, that kind of symbiotic relationship, is referred to as mutualism, because they mutually benefit. Okay, and so your book doesn't go into a lot of detail about kingdom fungi. And so we won't either. But let's move on to the plant kingdom and the last part of your notes today. Excuse me. So the plants are still eukaryotic, definitely multicellular, and they are also photosynthetic. Okay, but if you remember from biology, plants do have leaves and stems and roots that perform specific functions similar to the functions of the parts of the thallus on algae, but even more functions than that. Okay, with algae, you might have photosynthesis taking place in the blades, but also in the stipe and also in the holdfast. Photosynthesis can happen anywhere. That's not true of plants, right? Photosynthesis happens mostly in the leaves, and in some specialized plants it can happen in the stem, like the cactus. But there's 3 different types of plants that your book mentions, and the first one is the seagrasses. All right, so seagrasses, there's about 45 species of them, and they are found in shallow. I don't know if this is a blank. Let's see if this is actually a blank in your notes. I don't think it is. Let me check and see. No, it's not. So they're found in shallow, warm tropical waters. And so they are getting the sunlight they need to be photosynthetic. Okay, remember, these are vascular plants. Okay, if you remember, vascular plants are those type plants that have tube-shaped cells that carry xylem and that carry water and nutrients. Okay, we call it xylem and phloem in land plants, but these are vascular plants, and they produce flowers, they produce seeds, and their pollen is able to travel in the ocean on the currents. Okay, so they can fertilize each other in the ocean water, right? The flowers of one plant can be fertilized by the pollen of another plant. And so many of them will have a horizontal stem. So instead of they might have roots that go down into the ground, but they'll have a horizontal stem that helps to anchor them to sediment and rocks. And then from that horizontal stem, they'll have roots that come off of that, right? And so they can be a source of shelter, they can be a source of food for organisms, and they also help to hold the the sandy bottom of the ocean in place. So they help with erosion in that way. Your book talked about two different ones, not in a lot of detail, but the first one is eelgrass. This one's widely distributed. It has a thread-like pollen that fertilizes tiny little flowers. Okay, and so these flowers will eventually drop seeds into the sediment that's right below the grass. And so even though they are widely distributed, which means that they are found all over, the seeds are not carried far from the parent. Okay, and then the second example that your book gives is turtle grass, which has an even greater dispersion than the eelgrass, because the seeds are inside tiny little floating fruit, and because they're in floating fruit, they're able to be carried off, and then the seeds released farther away from the parent. Okay, so that gives a almost like a greater survival rate, because they're not competing with the resources that the parent plant would compete for. Okay, and so that's the first type of plant that your book talks about. The second type of plant that your book mentions is saltwater marsh plants. Okay, or they're otherwise called cord grasses. So these are going to be found in temperate regions. Temperate just means mild. Okay, it's not really hot, it's not really cold. Temperate is kind of the weather that we have in Georgia most of the time, except for hot summers. Our weather's pretty temperate, but they're found in temperate regions, and they're found in sandy coastal areas. So these are not the grasses that are going to be growing under the water necessarily, going to be growing along the shoreline in the marsh areas. Okay, they're a salt tolerant plant, so they can tolerate salt. Okay, but it's only the roots that are submerged, and that's only at high tide. Okay, so they're salt tolerant, but it's only the roots of the plant that is ever underwater. Okay, so they do have special glands in their leaves, because certainly the leaves would be exposed to the salt water, but they do have special glands that help them to remove excess water from their cells. So these saltwater marsh plants are they provide primary production. Remember, primary production is just that concept that there are organisms that produce more energy than what they need to survive, to provide biomass for other organisms to consume, and so that they can survive. They also provide habitat, and they protect against the shore erosion as well. All right, and then the third group of plants that your book talks about are the mangroves. You can see a picture there. The mangroves are usually only found in the tropics or the subtropics, so they are also salt tolerant. Okay, they live in the salty areas, but they're not totally submerged in salt water. So they are salt tolerant, but they are not tolerant of frost, right? So that's why they only live in tropics or subtropical areas. So these plants typically grow a little bit larger. They can be the size of a shrub or all the way up to the size of a tree. And where they grow, they can also create mangrove forest on muddy shores. And so the example that your book talks about is a red mangrove. The leaves of the red mangrove are very thick, excuse me, to help prevent water loss. But the other really interesting feature or characteristic of this plant is that it has something called prop roots. And these prop roots actually grow down from the branches and into the down into the soil or the sandy bottom, and it helps to it's a support feature for these plants. But because these prop roots can grow so thick and down from the branches, it can create kind of a gnarly dense undergrowth that's kind of webbed together. And because of that, these mangroves are also they're often referred to as island makers, because of the web of the root system of the mangrove. The sediments can build up around that root system, and that it helps to hold that in place, the sediments in place. And so islands can be formed around these types of trees that are growing in the water. So the other thing about mangroves that's mentioned in your book is that they have long seeds that grow on the branches, and they can actually sprout on the branches before they're dropped off of the tree. But when they do drop off in the water, they are able to float upright. They don't lay here and sink down in the water. They can float upright until they're able to sprout roots and kind of anchor down into that area where they need to grow. So that's an interesting feature about mangroves too. So that kind of wraps up Module 3. And again, just keep in mind that when you're studying, there's not a lot of vocabulary. There's really not a lot of processes. So there, it'd be a similar test, still matching, still some true false, some short answer, but just be looking at these different types of organisms, not bacteria. The quiz covered bacteria, the different types of protists, the different types of saltwater plants that we just talked about, and then the fungi, and just look at ways that they're similar and different. Look at how they're beneficial to the environment, and some of them even beneficial to humans, and just kind of keep that in mind as you're studying. And if you have any questions about today's video, just let me know. I will send the test to your parents hopefully within the next day, and so you can be looking for that. I appreciate your attention. Thanks, y'all. Have a good weekend.